About 2 years ago, I decided to move to Vietnam from America with only my hopes and my dreams, and after 2 years, I am still here today. My name is Henry, and on this channel, I talk travel for expats, digital nomads, and travelers who are looking for their next destination to visit. And in today's video, I want to talk about a beautiful country in Southeast Asia, a country where not many tourists return to. It is known for being very affordable, very cheap, but honestly, Vietnam has so much more going for it than just being affordable. After living here for 2 years, I have learned a lot about this country, and I want to go over all the great things and not so great things about Vietnam. Now, the first thing you should know and the first thing we should talk about is what are the biggest surprises expats face when moving or visiting Vietnam. Now, these challenges will depend on where you live, so keep that in mind. And the first thing I want to talk about is pollution. If you plan to live in the north of Vietnam, then the air is very harsh throughout the year. And at times, Hanoi can be the worst polluted city in the world, talking about specifically with the air pollution. In the south, it is a little bit better, but you will still have to deal with the harsh air pollution. When you first arrive, you might have to deal with a scratchy throat, congested nose. You might even have it for the first few months living in the city. If you plan to live near the beach like Da Nang or Nha Trang, then the air pollution will be a bit better. The air will be a little bit cleaner. So keep that in mind. Usually the cities have the worst air pollution and pollution of Vietnam, and that includes the smaller cities in the south and the north and in the center. The next thing you might struggle with is the infrastructure of Vietnam. Thailand is known for being a great digital nomad and expat destination because it has such great infrastructure, especially for a country in Southeast Asia. In some cases, it might even be better than many Western countries. Now, Vietnam doesn't have bad infrastructure, but it definitely is not comparable to Thailand, especially a city like Bangkok. And in Saigon, only recently the metro was actually built, and now it only has one line, so maybe in the next 5 to 10 years the metro will be fully fleshed out and we'll have multiple lines throughout Saigon. But definitely the infrastructure in Vietnam is a little bit behind some other cities in Southeast Asia. If you spend some time in the local areas of Vietnam, you can see that this country is still developing. Within the next 5 to 10 years, it could probably get to the level of a Thailand. Healthcare in Vietnam is pretty good. It's not too expensive. I think for most conditions, you should be fine with a private hospital here. Even public hospitals are pretty good as well. But for the more specialized conditions, then you might want to go to Singapore, which luckily is not too far from Vietnam, only about 2 hours flight. There's a common saying in Southeast Asia that I've heard from many people, and I kind of agree. After visiting all these countries, a lot of people say Thailand is 10 years ahead of Vietnam, and then many people say Vietnam is 10 years ahead of Cambodia. And I think that's pretty accurate, as Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia are very popular and probably the most visited Southeast Asian destinations outside of like Singapore when you talk about budget countries that you can afford. So Vietnam is a nice middle ground between somewhere like Cambodia and somewhere like Thailand. It's not the most developed in Southeast Asia, but it's not the least developed. It's definitely growing, especially with influence from Korea and many East Asian tourists visiting Vietnam more often now. Another negative that you will have to deal with living in Vietnam, especially in the major cities, is the traffic. During rush hour, traffic can be really bad. Expect to be in traffic up to an hour sometimes. Add 20 to 30 minutes to your commute. So when you visit Vietnam, it's ideal to stay central, like in District 1, just to be able to get around to the major destinations, the major tourist sites. On top of that, I think the roads here are not made to handle so many cars and trucks. Nowadays, a lot more locals, a lot more people here are getting cars, especially with VinFast. So it can be really frustrating if you have a motorbike driving around, being stuck in traffic because of all the cars. On top of that, the sidewalks are not the best for walking. It's really hard to just get out of your apartment, just go out and walk. But that's a thing in a lot of parts of Asia. It's hard to walk around unless you go to a park. Streets are not really made for walking. It's more to get to your destination. Places near the beach, smaller cities, it'll be a lot easier to walk. Just keep in mind you might have to dodge some scooters. Have you been in Vietnam before? Have you lived in Vietnam? I would love to hear your opinion on Vietnam, what you think. Now, the next thing is the food is also a bit of a change. If you like spicy food or food with lots of flavor, then maybe Vietnam is not the best place for you because the food here has flavor, but it's not so flavorful. The Vietnamese people don't really like spicy too much or anything with strong flavors like Indian food. That's why many Indian restaurants here don't do as well with the locals. So adapting to the food might be difficult, but generally the food is pretty good, especially when you eat in the 50K range and up. 50K Vietnamese dong, that is. Anything lower, the ingredients might be risky and not as fresh. 50,000 is a sweet spot for good local food. I've only had one one bad experience with food, luckily, and that's when I ate che, which is like a yogurt and kind of like boba mix. I haven't had it since then. That was the only time I had a bad experience with food. Otherwise, the food has been really good here. I've enjoyed the food a lot. My favorite food is bún chả or com tam. They're my favorite foods, my go-to foods. I guess also one of the negatives is that I think the best food in Vietnam is in Saigon. It has the most flavor, the most variety of food, because many local Vietnamese go to Vietnam for work to make money. You don't make as much money in other cities as you can in Saigon. Saigon is like the business central of Vietnam. Many people from the north, the central regions of Vietnam come to Saigon. So it's like all these flavors come together in Saigon, and the food is delicious here. Whenever I travel throughout Vietnam, the food is okay, it's fine, but I always miss the food in Saigon. So if you plan to live in Vietnam, maybe don't go to Saigon first and go straight somewhere else, because that way you'll kind of preserve your flavor for the food. But many people I've spoken to, many locals have told me that Saigon has the best food. So just keep that in mind. I guess I'm just very biased towards the South. And when it comes to the people, I think people are pretty nice here. I haven't had many bad experiences, but I will say in Vietnam, it feels like a me first society, especially when you drive around. A lot of people kind of think about themselves first before the greater good of the community or the things around them, the people around them. And you can notice that with traffic as well. Many people drive their scooters and don't really look before they turn or merge into the road. If you're at a shop, people will cut in front of you and put their stuff on a counter in front of you. I guess the concept of line is not very common here, and it's something that even local Vietnamese people get annoyed with. It's very common with the older generation to go in front of you at times. In the South, I have experienced this a few times. I'm not sure if it's much more common in the North. I also have heard that the North scams are pretty prevalent there. I've met many local Vietnamese from the South that have gone to Hanoi, and they have dealt with scammers trying to make them pay extra for stuff. And this is just what I have experienced. But I have met very nice, kind Vietnamese people. I think generally people in Asia, Southeast Asia, are much better at showing kindness, whether it's like true kindness or if they're just hiding how they truly feel about you and easy to put up a fake front of kindness. Compared to the West, I think people in Asia, Southeast Asia are generally more pleasant to interact with. And I will say the climate in Vietnam can be a difficult thing to adjust to. In the north, you get pretty cold winters, and then you get pretty warm summers. In the center and the south, the rainy season and monsoon season can be pretty bad, which is very annoying. The rain can be very cold rain, but then it can feel humid out. So adjusting to the climate can be hard for expats. The heat can also be pretty bad, but I personally like the heat. I prefer the heat over the rain or the snow. So that's something that you might like. Now, these are things you should just accept and anticipate when moving to Vietnam or visiting Vietnam. It's obviously not a perfect country, but I think the pros outweigh the cons. Definitely talk about the pros, and we'll start with the most common pro, the most common benefit of moving to Vietnam. And this first one is what most travel vloggers talk about. This is like usually the title of most videos, and it's how cheap and affordable Vietnam is. And that is true because you have places like Thailand, Singapore, Malaysia that are starting to become very expensive because of how much development they are experiencing, how many tourists and Westerners are moving there, how many East Asians are moving to these places. So I think compared to other countries in Southeast Asia, Vietnam is still pretty affordable. Cambodia might be much more cheaper than Vietnam, except the infrastructure is still developing compared to Vietnam. And even as an English teacher, you can have a pretty good, comfortable life. You won't save a lot of money to travel around the world or Asia consistently, but you can live pretty comfortably in Vietnam, in the cities, and still save a few $100s a month. Accommodation is cheap, and the quality of apartments are pretty good. You can get a pretty good one-bedroom apartment for like $400. $500, $600 can get you a pretty nice two-bedroom apartment, maybe a little bit of a luxurious apartment. And then $700, $800, you can get like a penthouse, a very nice place. If you want to save money, you can get a nice studio for like $250 to $350. So there are a lot of options for affordable apartments. If you have a big budget, then you can live very nice in a very good apartment in the center of like some big cities or right on the beach in a beach city. On top of that, like I mentioned before, the local food, especially in Saigon, is very delicious. I can eat Vietnamese food pretty often. Obviously, sometimes I need a break, but most of the food here is pretty good. You have com tam, com ga, bún chả, bún bò Huế that most Vietnamese people love. I think bún bò Huế is the most popular Vietnamese food in the South. Everyone I've spoken to loves it. Pho, obviously, many people love pho, especially if you go to Hanoi, Bun Ryu. So the food is delicious. You have for $1 to $2, $3, and like I said before, around the 50,000 Vietnamese dong range, you can find great meals, very good quality ingredients. And if you go up into like the 70K Vietnamese dong range, then you have like a very high-end meal, very good meal. Now, if you don't want to eat Vietnamese food, well, luckily, there's a lot of good Japanese food, Korean food, Chinese food in the cities of Vietnam. Da Nang has a lot of Korean restaurants. A lot of Korean businessmen open businesses in Da Nang, so Da Nang is pretty international. Hanoi, since it's close to the border of China, lots of Chinese food, I bet. So there's a variety of food, and the non-Vietnamese food can cost only like $4 or $5 for like a big meal, which is great. Hot pot is very popular in Vietnam, Korean barbecue hot pot. So there's variety of food in Vietnam. You're never gonna go starving. You're never gonna go hungry. Food is great. The healthcare here is also pretty affordable. You have some good private medical clinic, private hospitals that are pretty good, not too expensive, cover most conditions, most needs. And then you have some public hospitals that are pretty good if you know someone that can speak Vietnamese and help you out. You're pretty set on healthcare. Besides being really affordable, Vietnam is stunning. You have the south, which is more tropical and warm. You have the central area, which is a mix of forests, mountains, and some beaches on the coast. You have the Lat in the center, which is beautiful, amazing place to visit. Many Vietnamese locals loved going to Dalat. And once you get to the north, it can get a bit colder, more cool, especially near the winter. In the north, you have Hanoi, Haiphong, Halong Bay, Ha Giang Loop, many things to do in the north. In my experience, the south doesn't have as much culture or history, while the north is more traditional, more culture and history, but both have their pros and cons. They're both worth visiting, both regions. When it comes to beach towns and beach cities, usually Da Nang and Nha Trang are the most popular places to visit or be an expat in. They have the most modern amenities, best infrastructure, I'd say, for an expat who needs to work online. You have some smaller places like Quy Nhon has a lot less expats, which is, if you want something more local, then it can be okay for a few months, but might get boring, might be hard to live as well. Mui Ne, which is a nice beach in the south. And then you also have Vung Tau, but I don't really recommend Vung Tau. I don't love it as much. I don't like it as much. I think the beach is not as clean there. It's nice for a weekend, but the seafood there is okay. It's not so bad. And when it comes to the expat crowd and digital nomads, Vietnam doesn't have as big of a population of them as Thailand does. So you can still get the raw feel of being in a foreign country that doesn't feel like the West, but you still have some of your Western comforts. And luckily, there's still enough expats and digital nomads that you can make friends here pretty quickly, especially if you go on Facebook groups and go to clubs. And also making friends with locals here is not very easy. English isn't as widely spoken, so they're not as comfortable making friends with English speakers. So you really have to put in some effort to learn the language or make them feel comfortable to get to know you. When it comes to nightlife, Vietnam is not the best for nightlife. Even in Ho Chi Minh City, which is considered the younger, more like modern city, the nightlife is kind of meh here. There are some nice places, but it's probably not on the level of like a Bangkok, Thailand. Yeah, so the nightlife is not the best in Vietnam, which is great if you want to save money and just work and kind of relax. But I will say the cafe culture and the liveliness of the city is pretty nice. At least in Ho Chi Minh City, I love to drive around at night and seeing many people just drinking tea or coffee and sitting on the side of the road with their friends and just kind of enjoying their evening in a really chill way. They don't always have to be at the club or a beer club or a bar, hang out, and even going into like 11 p.m., 1 a.m., you can see many people out just eating or drinking or just hanging out on the side of the road, kind of chilling out. So it's nice to see that culture here doesn't revolve around clubs and going out. And now, like, the lifestyle in Vietnam can vary, like I said, depending on if you live in a city, which can be very busy, chaotic, hectic, or if you want to live on the beach, which is more relaxing, quiet, and calm. So you should kind of think about what kind of lifestyle you want, because you can get both. You can get the beach, you can get the city, and you can kind of even get like the mountains and more like close to nature lifestyle if you want to live somewhere like the Lat. Those places have a lot less expats, so you'll probably be more isolated, more forced to dive into Vietnamese culture. So I'd say the most common lifestyles here are on the beach, in a beach city like Da Nang, or in the city like Ho Chi Minh City, where you live among the expats and you occasionally go into the central part of the city. Now, the visas are definitely a big barrier to entry when it comes to Vietnam. Thailand has the Smart Visa, which is expensive, but you pay for it up front and you can become a digital nomad. And in Thailand, you don't have to worry about entering and exiting, getting new visas each couple months. Well, unfortunately, Vietnam does not have a digital nomad visa or anything like that. They have the entry visa, the e-visa. So the entry visa is only about 30 days. You enter it, you get it as soon as you enter. And then they have the e-visa, which is about 90 days. You have to apply for it. It takes about 2 to 3 weeks to receive. So that can be frustrating, and you have to be outside of Vietnam, I believe, to get that visa. So visa on arrival and an e-visa are the two most common visas. Many expats usually use the e-visa and just renew it every couple of months. So realistically, there aren't many options for like a long-term visa in Vietnam, which is a big downside. And I think it's a big reason you don't get many expats returning or people staying here long term. It's much easier to retire in the Philippines or in Thailand, especially since Thailand has that digital nomad visa. Now for the final verdict of whether Vietnam is worth moving to. I'd say yes for a short visit, stay here for 6 months, experience the culture, experience Vietnam for a little while, and then you can move somewhere else. I think for long term, it's very difficult. It's not as appealing as like a Thailand or Philippines. You don't have long term visa options. But the pros of Vietnam is it's not as busy or crowded as Thailand. It's not super underdeveloped, but not too crowded, not too overdeveloped. So it still feels like you're away from the West. So it kind of depends on what you want. However, it's rapidly developing. So who knows? Maybe in the next 5 to 10 years, it's going to be a lot easier to retire here, stay here long term. It's a no-brainer to just experience Vietnam.